Somewhere on the Roman frontier, in the last years of the 4th century, a historian named Ammianus Marcellinus sat down to describe a people nobody in the empire could explain. He wasn't writing myth, he was a soldier, a serious historian, a man who had marched with Roman legions and seen real enemies up close. But when he tried to put the Huns on paper, his account reads like something between an ethnography and a nightmare. He said they had no fixed homes, no fields, no houses. He said they were sewn into their clothes and wore them until they rotted off their bodies. He said they were born, lived and nearly died on horseback, eating meat they warmed under their saddles while riding at full speed. And he said their faces looked so different from anything Roman eyes had seen that some writers speculated they must not be human at all. This is where the story of the Huns begins. Not with the Huns telling us who they were, but with the people they terrified trying to explain what had just appeared out of the horizon. And that's the strange part of this whole story. In the end, we will know exactly what the Huns did. We will never really know who they were, in their own words, because they never wrote any down. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence itself is almost unbelievable. Sometime around 370 AD, a nomadic people crossed the Volga River into Europe. Nobody in Rome had ever heard the word before. Within a few years, they had crushed the Alans, then the Ostrogoths, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Eastern Europe. Then the Visigoths, terrified, did something no Germanic people had ever done at that scale. They asked the Roman Empire for permission to cross the border and live inside it, just to escape what was coming. Rome said yes. That decision, made purely out of fear of the Huns, ended up destabilizing the Western Roman frontier so badly it contributed directly to the Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Historians now consider that moment the real beginning of what we call the fall of Rome. And the Huns hadn't even reached Roman territory yet. They had simply shown up, and the shock wave alone reorganized an entire continent. So who were they? This is where it gets murky. Some historians connect the Huns to the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that had terrorized China centuries earlier, before collapsing and scattering west across the steppe. It's a compelling theory. It's also unproven, and serious historians still argue about it today. What we do know is that the Huns weren't one tribe. They were a coalition, absorbing Alans, Goths and other steppe peoples as they moved, growing stronger with every group they conquered, instead of just destroying them. And their real advantage wasn't numbers, it was the bow. The Hunnic composite bow, built from horn, wood and sinew, could outrange anything European archers were using at the time. And it could be fired at a full gallop. An army that could shoot you from horseback before you even got close was something Roman infantry tactics simply had no answer for. For the next 50 years, the Huns settled into the Great Hungarian Plain and did something almost more unsettling than raiding. They became a business partner. Roman generals started hiring Hunnic mercenaries. Roman emperors started paying them tribute just to stay away. A Hunnic king named Rugila spent years quietly extracting gold from Constantinople in exchange for peace. And it worked, until he died in 434, and left his kingdom to two nephews. Their names were Bleda and Attila. For about a decade, the brothers ruled together. Then, around 445, Attila had Bleda killed and took the throne alone. And this is where the story that everyone already half knows really starts. Attila didn't just raid the Eastern Roman Empire. He systematically extorted it, doubling and tripling the tribute Constantinople had to pay every year just to avoid war. And when the payments were late, he burned cities to remind them why they were paying. A Roman diplomat named Priscus actually travelled to Attila's court in 449 as part of a peace delegation, and his account is the only real eyewitness description we have. What he found wasn't a savage warlord. It was a functioning royal court, with feasts, translators, court poets, and complicated political intrigue. And at the centre of it, Attila himself, dressed more plainly than his own nobles, eating off a wooden plate while everyone around him used silver. Priscus was clearly unsettled by how unimpressive the most powerful man in Europe looked in person. In 451, Attila turned west into Gaul, with an army that ancient sources describe as almost apocalyptic in size. And for the first time, he lost. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a coalition of Romans and Visigoths, enemies who normally hated each other, stopped him. It wasn't a total defeat, but it was the first time Attila had been checked. So the next year he tried Italy instead, and this time nothing stopped him. Except, according to legend, Pope Leo I, who rode out to meet Attila in person and convinced him to turn back. Historians think plague, supply shortages, and pressure from the Eastern Roman army probably mattered just as much as the Pope's sermon. But the legend stuck because it made a better story. And honestly, so does everything else about this man. Then, in 453, at the height of his power, Attila died on his wedding night. According to Priscus's account, he had married a new bride named Ildico, drank heavily at the celebration, and was found dead the next morning, apparently from a severe nosebleed that choked him in his sleep. The most feared man in the ancient world didn't die in battle. He died from his own blood vessel. And here's the part almost nobody expects. His empire didn't survive him by more than a year. Attila's sons immediately started fighting each other over who would inherit the throne. And the Germanic peoples the Huns had ruled for decades, the Gepids, the Ostrogoths, people who had been forced into submission, saw their opening and revolted. At the Battle of Nidau in 454, that coalition crushed the Hunnic army for good. Within a generation, the people who had reorganized the map of Europe simply stopped existing as a political force. Some fled east, some were absorbed into the very kingdoms they had once ruled. And then they disappear from history almost as suddenly as they arrived in it. So here's the twist underneath this entire story. Everyone assumes the Huns were wiped out, but that's not quite what happened. They didn't get erased, they got absorbed, piece by piece, into the peoples around them, until there was no distinct Hunnic identity left to write down. And that's really the whole problem with this civilization. We have no Hunnic epics, no Hunnic law codes, no Hunnic version of what happened at Attila's court. Almost everything we know comes from the diplomats, soldiers, and historians of the people they conquered or terrified. Archaeologists have found bronze cauldrons, gold diadems, and skeletons with skulls deliberately bound and reshaped in childhood, a Hunnic aristocratic tradition. But almost nothing that tells us how the Huns understood themselves. The most powerful force in Europe for most of the 5th century left behind almost no version of its own story. Which raises a question worth sitting with. We remember the Huns as a symbol of chaos and destruction, the barbarians who ended the ancient world. But that reputation was built entirely by their enemies, the only ones who survived to write anything down. If your empire vanishes completely, and nobody who lived it gets to describe it in their own words, what's actually left of you isn't your history. It's just whatever the people who feared you decided to remember.